In southern Indiana, on a bend of the Ohio River, there is a wall over a mile long, built from split logs, with regularly spaced watchtowers. Behind it once lived thousands of people, in a planned city with streets and a central plaza. It was finished roughly 150 years before Columbus ever laid eyes on this coastline. And then, on a schedule nobody ever wrote down, everyone who lived there packed up and left, and simply never came back. No war record. No plague record. No European account of any kind, because no European had arrived yet to write one down. Just an empty city, and a genuinely open question archaeologists are still arguing about today. Most people who have even heard of ancient mound cities in North America know exactly one name, Cahokia, near modern St. Louis. Almost nobody has ever heard of its walled cousin, 400 river miles down the Ohio. It's called Angel Mounds today, named after a 19th century farming family who happened to own the land. Nobody knows what its own people called it. At its peak, this was one of the largest fortified towns anywhere north of Mexico. Estimates put the population well over 1,000 people, all living inside a defensive wall built from thousands of upright logs set deep into hand-dug trenches. The wall wasn't a simple fence. It bulged outward every so often into small bastions, platforms angled so defenders could see and strike along the length of the wall itself, not just straight ahead. That is a specific, deliberate piece of military architecture. Someone here understood siege lines and blind spots well enough to design around them, centuries before any European set foot on this river. So this was not a scattered village of scattered families. It was a planned, engineered, defended city with clear leadership behind it. And that single fact changes what question we should even be asking about why it eventually ended. Inside those defended walls, the skyline wasn't wooden rooftops at all. It was earth. 10 separate mounds, some of them genuinely enormous, built up basket load by basket load over many generations. The largest, now called Mound A, still rises more than 40 feet above the surrounding plain. To build it, workers carried an estimated hundreds of thousands of individual baskets of soil, one load at a time, for years. On top of Mound A stood a large building, rebuilt several times across the centuries, that archaeologists believe served as the residence of the town's paramount leader, and quite possibly a ceremonial temple as well, the two roles likely inseparable in a society like this one. Excavators found evidence that these summit buildings were periodically burned and rebuilt, layer over layer, almost like a controlled ritual renewal rather than accidental fire damage. Other mounds served other, quieter purposes, platforms for lesser officials, substructures for charnel houses where the dead were carefully prepared before burial, and one long, low mound whose exact function archaeologists still openly debate. Between the mound sat an open plaza, packed hard by generations of foot traffic, almost certainly the stage for public ceremonies, games, and the kind of gatherings that hold a city like this together. This was civic architecture, a skyline built entirely from earth and intention, in a place where, by every schoolbook stereotype, there wasn't supposed to be a city at all. So who actually lived here, and more practically, how did a town this size manage to feed itself reliably, for 100 years before refrigeration or a single steel plow ever touched this soil? The answer, mostly, is corn. Intensive maize agriculture worked into the rich floodplain soil of the Ohio River could support a population density unlike almost anywhere else north of central Mexico at that time. Archaeologists have recovered enormous quantities of charred corn kernels, along with beans, squash, and wild plant foods, all carefully stored in pits dug beneath the floors of ordinary homes. Houses here were rectangular, framed from bent saplings and covered in woven mats or thatch, clustered in neighborhoods along cleared streets radiating out from the central plaza, each with its own storage pit dug beneath the floor. Inside those homes, archaeologists found fine painted ceramics, carved tools of bone and stone, and ornaments made from marine shell that had traveled hundreds of overland miles just to reach this one river town. That shell alone tells you this town wasn't isolated at all. It sat inside a trade network stretching all the way to the Gulf Coast, moving goods, and almost certainly ideas and marriages, across enormous overland distances. This was a connected, fed, organized society, which makes its ending even stranger, because organized societies with full granaries don't usually just walk away. There's another layer to this town that has nothing to do with farming or defense. Some of its buildings appear to have been positioned with real precision. Researchers carefully studying the orientation of certain structures at Angel Mounds found alignments that plausibly track the rising sun on key seasonal dates, exactly the kind of marker a farming society would badly need to plan planting and harvest correctly. Picture the town's leaders on that one morning a year, standing on the plaza, watching the sun rise in exactly the gap they had built centuries of earthwork to frame. That's not superstition. That's applied astronomy, built into architecture, used to run an agricultural calendar for a city of 1,000 people who had no written numerals to fall back on. It's the same basic human instinct behind Stonehenge, or the great sun temples of Mesoamerica, applied completely independently, on a quiet riverbank in what is now the American Midwest. Which raises the obvious question. A society that could track the sun this precisely, that could engineer defensive architecture this deliberately, understood its environment extremely well. So when that same society reads its environment and decides, all at once, to leave, that decision is worth taking seriously. For nearly 500 years after it finally emptied, the site sat quietly under ordinary farmland, its mounds mistaken by more than one 19th century settler for nothing more than simple natural hills. The Angel family farmed this land for decades without fully realizing what lay beneath their fields. It wasn't until the state of Indiana purchased the property in 1938 that serious excavation began. The archaeologist who led that work, Glenn Black, would go on to spend nearly 3 decades of his life on this one site, one of the longest sustained excavations of a single place in North American archaeology. Layer by patient layer, his teams peeled back centuries. Post holes, hearths, storage pits, the charred floors of homes that had burned and been carefully rebuilt on the exact same footprint, generation after generation, family after family. What emerged wasn't a scatter of huts. It was a dense, planned urban footprint, streets, districts, public architecture, all preserved in the soil almost exactly as its last residents had left it. And crucially, what the excavators did not find was widespread evidence of a violent, sudden end. No mass graves. No layer of destruction across the whole town at once. Whatever actually happened here did not look, in the soil, like a single sudden catastrophe. It looked, layer after careful layer, like something considerably slower. But that peaceful ending sits awkwardly next to one very loud fact about this town. Someone built and repeatedly rebuilt over a mile of fortified wall around it. You don't invest that kind of sustained labor, generation after generation, defending against nothing. Something out there was enough of a threat to justify it. Across the wider Mississippian world in this same period, there's growing evidence of exactly that kind of tension, competing chiefdoms, seasonal raiding, and periodic outright warfare between neighboring river towns competing for the very best farmland. Angel Mounds sat at a strategic river junction, exactly the kind of location worth fighting over, and exactly the kind of location worth walling off. So picture two forces pulling at the same town, at the same time. A defended, fortified urban center built to withstand outside pressure. And, inside the walls, mounting pressure of another kind entirely. Because a wall keeps out enemies. It does nothing at all against a bad harvest. And that is exactly the second pressure archaeologists have found clear evidence for, written not into the town's defenses, but into the climate record itself. This is the part of the story that almost nobody outside specialist journals ever hears about. Sometime across the 1200s and 1300s, the climate across much of North America began shifting into what researchers now call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling trend that reshaped growing seasons continent-wide, not just here. For a society whose entire food surplus depended on a reliable growing season for corn, even a modest shortening of that season could mean the difference between a full granary and a hungry winter. Tree ring records recovered from this exact region show years of unusually poor growth clustering right around the very period when the town's overall population appears to have started its slow, steady decline. It's not one bad year that breaks a city like this. It's 5 bad years in a row, then a 6th, while the storage pits get shallower and the arguments over what's left get louder. Add river flooding patterns shifting unpredictably, and soil in the most convenient nearby fields growing exhausted after generations of continuous use, and a defended, walled home starts to look less like a fortress and more like a very well-built trap. This is the same broad pattern archaeologists now see repeating across multiple large Mississippian towns scattered through this general era, not just here on this one river bend. Climate stress, agricultural strain, then a slow, deliberate dispersal. Not a single catastrophe. A slow tightening of the noose, town by town, harvest by harvest, across an entire region. And at some point in that tightening, the people of this particular walled river town made a decision their descendants never wrote down, because writing wasn't part of their world. Archaeologists now estimate the town was largely emptied sometime around 1450, roughly 40 years before Columbus's first voyage ever reached the Caribbean. The evidence doesn't point to panic. Valuable, portable goods that a fleeing population would grab first are largely absent from the final occupation layers. It looks, instead, like a slow, staged withdrawal. Families leaving in groups, over what may have been years rather than days, carrying the tools and seed corn that mattered most, and leaving the rest to the earth and the coming grass. Where did they go? The most likely answer, based on later archaeological and oral tradition evidence, is that their descendants dispersed into smaller, more mobile communities across the wider region, some eventually connecting to the historic tribes European colonists would go on to meet centuries later. The city didn't really vanish so much as it slowly dissolved, its population and its accumulated knowledge scattering outward into smaller, more mobile, more resilient groups better suited to riding out a harder climate. That's not a mysterious ending in the sense of aliens or curses or lost technology. It's a very human one. A big, ambitious, centralized city eventually costs more to maintain than the land around it can afford, and people are rational enough to notice before it's too late. But knowing the likely why doesn't make the site itself any less genuinely startling to actually stand inside today. Because for nearly 200 years, this was one of the largest, most organized, most heavily defended towns anywhere on the entire continent, and almost nobody alive today has ever even heard its name. Compare that to Cahokia, 400 miles up the Mississippi, which draws hundreds of thousands of visitors and sits on World Heritage shortlists. Angel Mounds is smaller than Cahokia, but it may be the best preserved fortified Mississippian town anywhere in North America, because quiet farmland protected it for 5 centuries instead of a growing modern city paving straight over it. Nearly 3 decades of careful, unhurried excavation left behind one of the most complete pictures archaeologists anywhere have of daily Mississippian life, from ordinary cooking pits to children's toys to the post holes of entire lost neighborhoods. And the palisade wall itself, rebuilt at least 3 separate times over the town's history, remains one of the largest and best documented examples of pre-contact fortification architecture in North America. Today the mounds themselves are protected, quiet, grassed over, walked by a small fraction of the visitors who cross oceans every year to tour far more famous ruins on other continents entirely. Which is, in its own quiet way, exactly backwards. This was a walled, engineered, astronomically aligned, 1,000-person city, older in its final built form than most of the cathedrals tourists happily cross oceans to go and see. It simply happened to be built from earth and timber instead of stone, on a continent whose deep urban history most people were never taught existed at all. So return to that wall. Over a mile of timber, rebuilt 3 times, watchtowers spaced with real military logic, defending a city that could read the sun well enough to plan its harvest by it. That is the very city that, on no Europeans' orders and for no Europeans' reason at all, quietly emptied itself 2 full generations before anyone with a written language ever arrived here to ask why. The best current answer, carefully pieced together from tree rings, emptying storage pits, and nearly 3 decades of patient excavation, is that a slowly cooling climate broke the one resource this entire engineered city ultimately depended on, a reliable harvest, year after year. Not conquest, not plague, not mystery in the movie sense at all. Just an extraordinarily capable society reading its own environment correctly, and choosing to survive by scattering rather than slowly starving together behind its own wall. That single collective decision is why, today, you can stand in the exact center of that plaza, between mounds built patiently basket load by basket load, and hear absolutely nothing at all but the wind. A planned, walled, astronomically precise American city, abandoned, not forgotten by its own descendants, who scattered and quietly carried its knowledge forward. Just forgotten, for 500 years, by everyone else.